Dr. Day, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for having me. My name is Rebecca Williford, and I'm the president and CEO of Disability Rights Advocates. We are a nationwide nonprofit legal center, and our mission is to advance the rights, inclusion, and equity of people with disabilities, people with all types of disabilities, mainly through high-impact litigation. So we are the legal arm, the litigation arm of the disability rights movement, and we have offices in Berkeley, New York, and Chicago. We opened our doors in Berkeley, which is the birthplace of the disability rights movement, as you all may know, just 3 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. We turned 30 years old this year, which is really exciting, and our founders really saw the need. We were founded by, one of our co-founders used a wheelchair, and we were founded by folks who saw the need to, it was wonderful that we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it was going to require enforcement by design, is how Congress designed it, which would, require litigation or the threat of litigation. And I know, here comes the lawyer part. I always tell everybody, everything always starts with a letter, and we often get some really great results just from that. But we found that a lot of big entities don't want to make systemic change, and that it's really hard to get systemic change without at least filing a lawsuit. So we, and from the time we send a letter to the time we litigate cases, it can be a very short amount of time. It can be a few months, or it can go on for years, as I will talk about. And so I know this is pivoting from sort of the case studies and some of the other medical parts of the conference, but it's exciting to be able to talk about this work, both as a person with a disability who lives it and somebody who's sort of practicing this. I know you all are encountering, people with disabilities all the time in your work, and I'm sure you get questions about, nobody really teaches you how to be a disabled person and navigate the world. And there's a lot of great resources out there, and there's a wonderful, vibrant community. So I'm hopefully here to shed a little light on that. So I wanted to start with just an overview of the disability rights movement. Promise, it's not gonna be very long, but we're gonna start with the Revolutionary War. I think it's really important to, when we think about where we are today and the opportunities and the rights that people with disabilities have, it's really important to think about where we started and, where we got here, and sort of what the government has done, what citizens have done, to get us where we are. So, following, and a lot of it actually, the U.S. disability rights movement revolves a lot around what happened with wars and people who were disabled by wars, and newly disabled veterans, and also what the president of this country wanted to do about disability rights. So Revolutionary War was the first time that we see pensions, we see a federal program, we see pensions for newly disabled veterans, we see the federal government really recognizing this is a need, this is something that's really important to commit money and resources to. From there we go into what was, quite frankly, a very ugly period of people with disabilities, a lot of them being institutionalized, lots of eugenics, sort of trying to stamp out disability. It was seen as something that was shameful. We had a president who used a wheelchair who hid that, but who, in retrospect, it's really interesting to think about that. Then when we get to after World War II, we have a lot more physically disabled veterans, and organizations like the Paralyzed Veterans of America spring up. We have, also the National Federation of the Blind. We see other types of disability rights organizations springing up. We see disabled people, beginning to organize. Then when Eisenhower comes to the White House in the 50s, he enacts Social Security. And again, we're seeing more of a financial commitment. In the 60s, JFK, because of his family background, begins some early deinstitutionalization efforts. Then we enter the 70s, and sort of hearkening back to Berkeley, which is really sort of where the independent living movement started with Ed Roberts. He was, lived in an iron lung for a lot of the time. He was a wheelchair user and the first one at UC Berkeley, and he started the first Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. And now we have hundreds of centers for independent living all over this country that are helping people with disabilities live independently. These aren't places where people go to live, but they're nonprofits that help provide resources to disabled people. And then in the 70s, we also get our first really big piece of federal legislation, which I am still using, DRA is still using today to litigate cases, and that was the Rehab Act of 1973. And that legislation required just forbid any entity that was getting federal funding from discriminating on the basis of disability. Also, during this period of time, we're realizing that people with disabilities need to be educated. So the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act was passed, and that's where a lot of talk about sort of IEPs and free appropriate public education comes from. That's kind of the genesis of all that. Then we're going to fast forward to the 90s. In 1990, we get a very beautiful bipartisan Americans with Disabilities Act passed and signed into law in 1990. And then when a lot of things happened, but today we are very much in a place of disability pride and disability culture are alive and well, and people with disabilities, there's definitely a process of becoming disabled and thinking about disability as part of a person's identity, but it can be something that's actually really empowering for people with disabilities. And everybody is, as you all probably see with your patients, in very different places in terms of where they are and accepting that as part of their disability. But I would just, I love being a part of the disability community. I go to disability pride parades. We have our own flag. So just know that it can be a really good thing and a really wonderful community. When we think about, there's no sphere of life that disability doesn't touch. So when we think about the types of, the aspects of life where disability rights laws establish access, I've got a list up here, but it's everything from the building blocks of society, looking at architectural barriers, looking at employment, healthcare, juvenile justice, access to prisons, and the list goes on. Voting, veterans benefits, basically any sphere. And our work is evolving. When when the ADA was passed before the internet was really in existence, and so but as the law has evolved, websites need to be accessible for people who are blind and who are using screen readers. So it is a very much a living, breathing thing, and it's part of our job at DRA to sort of use the law to bring cases that will move the law forward and advance rights to people with disabilities, and really be sure that this country is delivering on the promise of the ADA. So I wanted to first talk about a couple of the protections that are under federal statutes. I mentioned the Rehab Act earlier. This, the Rehab Act turned 50 years old this year, which is really exciting. And again, it was the first piece of federal legislation requiring that programs and activities that were receiving federal financial assistance couldn't discriminate on the basis of disability. So this had a really huge impact, particularly in the higher education context. Pretty much every college or university is getting some sort of federal funding, and it meant that those institutions had to look inward and figure out how to become accessible. And then the other, and these are just, there are many, many federal statutes that apply. I'm just highlighting the Rehab Act and the ADA because those are the ones that are most common. But the thing I love about the ADA is, it's about 20 years after the Rehab Act, and Congress, it is this very broad and wonderful recognition by Congress that we had the Rehab Act, but discrimination against disabled people is so rampant in this country that we need a federal statute to protect them, when it comes to more than just federally funded programs. So the ADA is really expansive in what it applies to. And the three main titles that we think about the most are titles 1, 2, and 3. Title 1 applies to employment. So, any employer with 15 or more employees needs to provide the full range of employment opportunities, regardless of disability. Title 2 applies to state and local governments. So we wanted to get the same protections at the federal level for the state and local governments. Again, Title II is requiring state and local governments and their programs to provide equal opportunity to people with disabilities when it comes to all the programs, services, and activities that are being provided. And some of the examples there are, public education, transportation, recreation, healthcare, voting, all sorts of things are required to provide access under Title II. And then Title III was, taking the Rehab Act a step further. It applies to places of public accommodations. So private businesses that are open to the public, nonprofit service providers are all now required to not discriminate based on disabilities. So all of a sudden, restaurants, hospitals, doctors' offices, stores, all sorts of, sports stadiums, private schools. So we're getting, more and more access for people with disabilities is, the law is providing for. But it was up to, by design, it's up to people with disabilities to enforce these laws. Very few entities sort of did this on their own, which is why my organization exists and why we have continued to exist for 30 years, because there is this huge need. And it is, our clients are my heroes because it takes a lot to sort of put yourself out there, and be the face of enforcing your rights, but it's often something that is required, and, isn't, folks don't necessarily have a roadmap for how to get involved. So I do a lot of sort of, translating sort of what litigation means and how we do it and how we support our clients through the process. And so I wanted to highlight just a few examples of cases that DRA has worked on that might be sort of relevant to y'all's work. And just sort of, these are things that we can achieve with the type of impact litigation that DRA does. And when we talk about impact litigation, I should have said earlier, we're mostly talking about class actions. And we're talking, and our goal in these cases is to get, get what we call injunctive relief, but to get barriers fixed is the goal of these cases. We don't typically do cases where clients are getting, monetary damages for, what they have gone through, but just kind of by design. This is how the statute is. So we're, trying to, get the fix. We're trying to get, the accessible sidewalks, the education access, the standardized testing accommodations, employment, transportation, healthcare. So when it comes to sidewalks, I'm just going to sort of highlight, and being a nationwide nonprofit, we've been able to bring cases. A lot of our work started in California because that's where we originated, and we had a lot of success getting really good precedents in courts here. And then we were able to sort of take that on the road and bring similar cases, in places like New York. So sidewalks is one of those cases. So we've done sidewalk access cases nationwide, and the problem here is, missing sort of as you're navigating down a sidewalk, sort of, broken pieces of sidewalk that make it impossible to navigate over, and then missing curb ramps at intersections. And these are all things that are required under disability rights laws. And we first started with a case in 1999 in Sacramento, and we were able to get a very comprehensive settlement agreement after some litigation there, getting the city to overhaul its entire sidewalk system to address missing, unsafe, dangerous curb cuts and corners and removing barriers. And since then, we've done similar cases in California, in New York City, and in Philadelphia. And this problem exists all over the country. So I think we're kind of always working on sidewalk work because there's so many cities where this is still an issue. And it's, we tend to represent definitely wheelchair users in these cases, and also sometimes people with vision disabilities who are trying to navigate safely. So the next topic I want to talk about is education access. So we, the issue of, college and university campuses having accessibility barriers for wheelchair users is a chronic problem across the country. We've done several of these cases. I think our very first one, though, was in the late 90s against UC Berkeley. And you can see this case was filed in 1997. It took until 2005. I mean, we sort of litigated and were in settlement until 2005 in this case. And we just now wrapped up the monitoring of this case. So in a case like that, where you have an entire campus and you've had, in these cases, we typically have an expert go through the whole campus, top to bottom. They're, noting every barrier that needs to be fixed. And then there's a remedial plan that gets created and has to be implemented. So that, it takes a really long time. And DRAs with the case start to finish. Like we're there working up the case in the 90s, and then we're there getting monitoring reports, making sure that things are staying on track as we are, as the university is making itself more compliant. But, here the issue is, students are, want to be able to get into all the campus buildings. They want to be able to have their pick of residence halls. They, again, sort of, hearkening back to that promise of the ADA and not thinking, oh, well, I can't major in that because they would have to move all my classes and I couldn't get into office hours and that's going to be a nightmare. So we're just truly trying to level the playing field with all of this. So another one is standardized testing accommodations. And this is one that is, particularly as folks are trying to, move through the education and professional tracks, there's standardized tests that they have to take along the way, and they need accommodations. And we, often, testing entities are skittish about allowing folks to use various assistive technologies, but we were able to get a really good result that is applicable not just to people who are blind, but people that are using any assistive technology in a case against the National Conference of Bar Examiners several years ago. And in this case, we had a blind test taker who wanted to use screen reading software to take the bar exam, and was told she couldn't do that and instead had to work with a human reader, which is a night and day. Anybody who's used a screen reader technology their whole life being told you've got to work with a stranger that you've never met before on the most important exam of your life. That's a no-go. The court agreed with us, and we got a really good result that, when these entities are administering exams, they have to they have to, administer the exam to best ensure that the exam results are reflecting the individual's aptitude and not measuring their disability. So that's something to keep in your back pocket. If you've got patients coming to you thinking about standardized tests and needing letters of support for accommodations, that can be a whole challenge for folks. Okay. All right, so then, all right, I'm trying to just move through the phases of life. We get through education, and now we're employment. I'm going to just share a quick anecdote about one of our clients in New York City. This was Dania Manderson. She was a tenured school teacher with New York City Department of Education. She uses a power chair. And for years, she worked at a school where she did not have an accessible restroom, and there was no accessible point of refuge designated for emergency evacuations. And this is an example of something that we resolved in 8 months. We sent a letter, and then it was, we had a settlement agreement, within 8 months. And this was just a couple of years ago. So, there's still very basic things like getting to the restroom that are still so problematic, 33 years after the ADA was passed. And so this is an example of a case that wasn't a class action, but it's a case that we took on because it is the impact of the case, made a difference for any teacher, coming behind her, who also uses a wheelchair and needed those accommodations. So also an example of other types of cases we take. And I'll talk about just a couple more before I turn it over to Vance. Transportation, getting around, whether you're going to school, work, just trying to live your life. Disabled people want to be out in the world working and socializing and doing all the things. You may know that currently the New York City subway system is highly inaccessible to people with mobility disabilities. Only 25% of the subway stations have elevators. And so since 2011, we've been in litigation against the New York MTA, and we very recently got a great settlement in which they agreed to install elevators in 95% of their stations. So it's going to take a while. It's going to take until 2055. So again, long remedial periods for some of this stuff. But really, really important to see the progress. And then we're continuing litigation to try to get an agreement that once those elevators are installed, that the MTA will maintain them and keep them in good working order, because an elevator that's broken all the time or vandalized is no good and just really keeps disabled folks from being able to move around freely. You've got to backtrack, you've got to reconfigure your plans, you're missing out on socializing, and that's not the world that the ADA envisions. And so there's still lots of work to do on transportation systems across the country. And then just touching a little bit on healthcare access. So we have represented patients with various types of disabilities in healthcare settings when they weren't able to get accommodations that they needed. So a couple of these in the Bay Area, we had a case against Sutter Health many years ago, and then also Beth Israel or Heritage Continuum in New York. And these were all cases where, patients, there were architectural barriers, in the healthcare facilities that were keeping disabled people from getting healthcare. So it, ranged from actual barriers, not being able to get into the facility or only being able to access part of the facility to accessible medical equipment. But, we had patients who hadn't had, basic gynecological exams, sometimes ever, sometimes in years, because there wasn't, an exam table with that was at an accessible height. So again, these all started with letters, and sometimes they result in great settlements, but sometimes we have to litigate to get results. And so with both of these, we got really good settlements, and patients are now able to get fuller access to care, which is really critical. And then also in the healthcare setting, people with vision and communication disabilities have often come to us because they've not been able to access what they've needed. So in a case, or actually we did structured negotiations with Kaiser to get representing people who are blind to get access, getting, Braille, audio, large print, talking prescription labels, trying to be sure that people, people who are blind could actually access, healthcare information independently and privately. We had, blind clients who were having to rely on friends or strangers to read them their, lab results or, letters from their healthcare providers. And we were able to get a really good agreement to, to make that, to address those barriers and provide that independence. And then also for people who were deaf, we were approached by several deaf people who had the experience of being in the hospital, sometimes for very extended periods of time, and not being able to get a sign language interpreter. And it's really important. Sign language is a very different language from written English. So writing notes back and forth isn't sufficient. And especially, some of these situations where, a deaf mother who had a premature newborn who was in the NICU for a very extended period of time, trying to have conversations about her daughter's life or death through scribbled notes, which is just not effective communication, and she didn't have full information to make decisions. But we were able to work with the hospital to get a good settlement agreement, get policies in place, get training for staff about what to do when deaf patients show up and how to be sure that they are getting, an equal experience. And I'm happy to say that the baby that was in the NICU is doing very well today, and is thriving in elementary school. But that was sort of a wake-up call for that, that client group. All right, so I think I'm kind of at time. So the last couple of slides are just some resources, both for providers and healthcare providers, and for patients. So I will just kind of leave these here. I'll just highlight a couple of resources that I recommended to both. If you've not read Emily Liddell's book on demystifying disability, it's a great book. It talks about how to be an ally. It talks about, how to talk about disability, how to think about disability, and is a really wonderful resource. And then Squirmy and Grubbs are content creators. Some of you all may know Shane and Hannah Burkall. They are content providers. Shane has SMA and is really sort of, opened up his life on YouTube and on social media, showing what it's like to live with his disability and how he is living in the world. And Shane is also a DRA board member. So I always like to be sure that folks know about those resources. Also on the resources for people with disabilities, if you've got folks who are looking for kind of a first, I always like to be sure that people know about the protection and advocacy agencies that exist in every state. That's kind of a first line legal defense if somebody has a really individualized legal issue. Every state has one, and there's a link where folks can find theirs. And then there's also a link where people can find their local Center for Independent Living Center. So that center in Berkeley that Ed Roberts started, again, there's hundreds of them across the country today, and their goal is to help people with things like I can't get my wheelchair insurance through, things like that. They provide sort of, some of them have attorneys on staff, but a lot of this can be done through sort of non-legal advocacy when it comes to that. And their goal is to keep people with disabilities out of institutions, living independently in the community, and choosing to live how they want to live. So I've left a link here for how you can subscribe to our e-newsletter if you'd like to stay in touch with what we're doing. Also, contact information is here, and we don't send out too many e-newsletters, not too many, so several times a year.
Jeff, Rebecca, I appreciate the foundation, right, that gets laid when we talk about these fundamental rights and these rights that have been now enshrined within law, of course, at the federal level and the state level. One of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing is looking at how these laws impact things as it really relates to emergency preparedness, emergency planning, response, and recovery. So kind of switch gears a little bit, but please, take what I'm saying in terms of not just good information to have, but information that is really ultimately rooted in a legal basis. One of the things that we see, and by the way, way of introduction, I should say a little bit about who I am. I'm Vance Taylor. I serve as the chief for the Office of Access and Functional Means at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. So, super long title. The title doesn't really matter. It's really the work that we do. Essentially, the office that I lead exists because there's a recognition that anytime there's a disaster, flood, fire, earthquake, doesn't matter what it is, that there's a disproportionate impact on individuals who have access or functional considerations. So specifically, and for this group, it's important to note that includes people with disabilities. We find that impact leads to increased human suffering. It leads to increased loss of life. That really became, I think, something that gained national recognition during Hurricane Katrina. It was during Hurricane Katrina that we watched as 70% of everybody who perished had an access or functional need. So what does that say about the way that we have, as a society and emergency managers, plan for individuals with access and functional needs? There have been gaps. And it's never been intentional. What you've had really are good people trying to do good things. But especially in emergency management, where you have a lot of former first responders, former law enforcement, former military, great individuals who run towards danger because they want to help, but people who don't have a lived experience with access or functional needs. And so they were planning together without the benefit of the knowledge, diversity, and experience of people with lived experience. And so the plans that they created had fundamental gaps. We saw those gaps during press conferences when there was no ASL interpreter. And that happened because people didn't stop to consider the fact that, hey, that life-saving information you're putting out, it's going to fall on deaf ears. And people didn't stop to consider the fact that when you point during a press conference to an evacuation map and say, go here for safety, If you're blind or have low vision, that means nothing to you. You can't process that information. If you only put things out or information out in English, if you don't speak English, that information means nothing to you. And so at every step along the way, individuals in the community who were probably already on the margins were pushed out further. And they didn't know what was coming. And they didn't know how to prepare. And they didn't know where to go for safety. And because of that, many suffered and many languished. And so, recognizing this issue, California leaned forward, and the governor created the Office of Access and Functional Needs and placed a senior level gubernatorially appointed executive to lead that office. Now, I was appointed in 2015 by Governor Brown. I was reappointed by Governor Newsom. And my responsibility is to really move forward on a two-part mission. One, to identify what are the needs that all Californians have before, during, and after events. And then two, to work in partnership with the whole community in order to integrate those needs throughout every facet of the emergency management process. So what does that mean for a bunch of doctors? What does that mean for a bunch of people in this space? Well, at the same time that we're looking to try and find ways to help people live fuller, healthier, more independent lives, we are past the point where we can think we can do that without addressing emergency management. It used to be the case, right, that disasters happen to other people. But I'll bet if I were to ask by a show of hands, take who in the audience today has been impacted in some form or fashion by disaster. Either you had loss of power, or you had to evacuate, or your home burned, or somebody you know had a home that burned, or you were impacted by poor air quality, or an extreme heat event. Most people would raise their hands. So we can't think in yesterday's terms, right, where disasters happen to other people. What we can do is work to ensure that at the same time we're trying to promote the science of longevity and well-being, that we're promoting principles of preparedness and resilience. Are individuals with muscular dystrophy that want to live independently in the community developing personal evacuation plans? Are they connected within the emergency management system? Are they able to hunker down if needed for a couple days? Do they have support networks that can do wellness checks, that can assist them during times of crisis? Have they signed up for emergency alerts? Right? Are they having these conversations? If not, the likelihood that they're going to have a negative impact from a very real disaster is much higher than it should be. Recognizing I've got about 2 minutes left, I will just simply say this, that everybody in this room has an opportunity, because of who you are and the role that you play, to be the right person at the right time in the lives of the individuals that you work with and serve. And I know how impactful that can be. I've got 2 daughters. That when our second daughter was born, my wife went into labor. We loaded up in the van, headed to the hospital, and got stuck on the highway. It was downtown DC traffic. It was a weekday at about 8 in the morning, and it was a parking lot. It would have been faster if I would have gotten out of the van, sat her on my lap, and drove her there in my wheelchair than to get the other way we were headed. And she turned to me and said, "I'm going to have this baby in the van." And I remember thinking, I'm not built for this, right? I'm not that guy. And I looked around and I found that there happened to be a police officer next to us. And I explained in a very articulate way what was going on. I think my exact words were, "Help." And he asked, "Would you like a police escort?" I said, "Yeah." And then he said, "Yeah, we don't really do that." And he rolled his window up. And our hearts collectively sank. And a few minutes went by, and my wife's getting emotional, I'm getting emotional. And our desperation must have oozed out of our van and into his squad car, because he put his window back down and said, "I'm going to turn my lights on, stay on my tail, we'll get you there." And the next thing I knew, we're bombing our way through downtown DC traffic, which, if you ever get the chance to get a police escort, do it. It's exhilarating. I told my wife, "Thank you for this experience." She was not as thrilled as I was at the time. We pulled up to the hospital. He took off. I didn't get to shake his hand. I didn't get to say thank you. I didn't know his name, but moments later, we went into the hospital and our daughter was born. And every year on her birthday, my daughter makes the same request. "Tell me the story." And so every year I do. Well, she just turned 16. And she said, "Daddy, tell me the tale," right? So I did. And I found myself getting choked up as I looked at this kind, capable, smart, beautiful young woman. And it was because I couldn't help but think, what tale would I tell had it not been for the right person at the right time in my life when we needed them the most. And so I mean it when I say I know what it means to benefit from having the right person in your life at the right time. You have that opportunity to tell the individuals that you work with that they have rights, that there are systems that are set up to ensure that they can be the best versions of themselves, that they can succeed academically, professionally, personally, and to help ensure that they can be safe and secure and healthy regardless of what disaster may come their way. And that as they navigate these different aspects of life, that they can truly achieve their dreams. I want to thank you for your partnership and thank you for what you do and applaud you for your efforts, and let you know that if there's any way that I can support you or my office can support you, that we're happy to do that. But don't forget that it's a lift, but that you don't have to lift alone. You lift When Rebecca's going to lift, and I'll lift. And together, the people we care about will ascend. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Vance. That was fantastic. And Rebecca, we do have a few questions. One of them, a couple of them are fairly local. Let's start with this one. Are there requirements for apartment complex owners regarding wheelchair and walker accessibility?
Oh, so do you want me to answer this
Yeah,
one?
I think.
So I should say that I cannot provide legal advice, but generally there is a Fair Housing Act. There are requirements for accessible housing. And there are lots of housing organizations out there that can help specifically answer these questions.
I mean, I think some of these also kind of boil down into, maybe I'll put them together. And it comes up almost in relation to what you were talking about sidewalks.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some awful sidewalks out there. I almost killed myself in Cambridge, Massachusetts recently. And I don't know how any disabled people live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, especially in the winter. Once you get a nice ice coating on these horrible sidewalks, I think they're just treacherous. And I guess to put this into a form of a question, the question is kind of, are there both federal and state and local laws that we are going to depend on for this? Or, I mean, how far down do the federal laws kind of help? And do we need to be acting at all levels in order to really get everything rectified everywhere?
So the federal laws do, so when we, in our cases that we have brought against cities across the country, the federal laws do apply there, and depending on the state you're in, there are sometimes state and local laws as well that also sort of protect and ensure those rights.
So basically, we kind of need to be working at all levels in order to really get
I
this
think,
done.
with sidewalks, I think a couple of things. One is, it often takes people with disabilities actually enforcing their rights, often, through legal mechanisms. But I think also, to the extent, we don't have nearly enough people with disabilities working. I want to see people working in all layers of government, people working from the inside, in a lot of these like local government positions have a lot, there's a lot of potential there, to really bring that lived experience and really push that forward. Now, that being said, I don't think it's fair to, rely on the disabled person to be carrying that agenda, and no one wants to be, tokenized in these roles. But I think, it's very easy when you're not working alongside a disabled colleague to think of that, to think of them and to think of their needs as other. But, the more we can integrate people with disabilities into sort of every layer, the more we can sort of integrate, and that's everything from local government to the media. And let's have, people with disabilities are portrayed all the time in films and movies, but it's often very negative. Like, let's see, disabled heroes. So I think that sort of spans across society.
No, I think that's a great answer. There was a question, and this wasn't directed towards either one of you particularly, so maybe you both have some response to it, and that is, do clients need to pay for your services?
So at DRA, we don't charge our clients. We're a nonprofit. And then there's lots of other nonprofits. A lot of them are in the resource lists that also don't charge clients as well. There are also not nearly enough sort of pro bono and low bono attorneys to do all the disability rights advocacy work that needs to be done across the country. We get so many intakes that need really individualized help that we aren't able to assist. But we don't charge. We rely a lot on, on fundraising, and, we just had our 30th anniversary gala.
Right.
Yeah.
Congratulations. It's
Thanks.
fantastic. And Vance, I mean, how do people take advantage of your your services
No,
and awareness?
we're state government, so we don't charge. We work with jurisdictions, we work with private sector partners, we work with community-based organizations. Anybody we can partner up with, we're happy to do it. So you can go to the CalRS website, really easy to get a hold of us.
I mean, there's also, we have a fairly large international audience on virtually, and I'm curious, how they can be learning from the US, but also is the US learning from what's going on internationally? Do you have awareness of other countries that are doing things that we should be emulating?
So I'm not an expert on sort of the international disability sphere. What about you, Vance? Our work is, because it's legal work, it's all very focused in the U.S. We do from time to time interact with folks, and learn about different initiatives that are happening abroad. But I'm curious if Vance has more exposure on that.
Yeah, just from the emergency management perspective, but we've hosted delegations from Chile, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, just in the last, I think, 6 months. So we're very fortunate, particularly in California, as the world's 5th largest economy, to have a footprint that covers 40 million people, many of whom have disabilities. And to lean forward in a way that no other state in the nation has. Has enabled California to lead the nation in inclusive planning and really set the standard that gets instituted worldwide. So we're happy to share that all of our best practices. At the same time, we know that other nations think forward in other areas as well. And so we would absolutely love to do information exchanges. Anybody wants to take our stuff, copy, paste, put your logo on it, it's yours. But yeah, definitely want to know what's happening in other places.
That's great. Yeah, Tina? Is that on?
Oh, there, okay. No, switch. Thank you so much for what you do for fighting inequities in this society. It does take a village, and your leadership is huge in making some of these things work and make this kind of change. And we know it takes a really long time. We appreciate what you're saying. And I have actually a question, couple questions for Vance, in particular about the emergency management. One is your position is so important. And we know that what you're doing here in California. Are there similar positions with people such as yourself for emergency preparedness in other states? The second one is, as we're clinicians, what advice could you give us to ensure that when we're speaking to our patients, they are prepared for different types of natural disasters or emergencies that may occur? Or do you have resources for that?
Yeah, no, great question. Thanks, Tina. So California is the only state in the nation where we've got a senior executive appointed by the governor to do this work. Other states, not many, but there's a handful of other states that have access and function needs coordinators, but they're typically 5-6 ranks down the ladder. So the difference is that, when COVID was going on, when these wildfires break out, when we're dealing with atmospheric rivers and decisions are being made that are going to impact large numbers of Californians, there is a voice in the room to help ensure that the governor and the director can make the best, most informed decision. And there have been many times when discussions are taking place, voices get heard, concerns are addressed, and afterwards, I'm told I had never looked at it that way. But I'm so glad you said something we didn't know. So representation matters. And bad things happen when you plan for people and not with them. So the fact that, California's got somebody in the room, that's important. I would love to see other states follow suit. Your second question, remind me the second question?
My second question was, what advice would you give clinicians for us to talk to or ask to our patients for them to be prepared for the
Oh, yeah. I mean, so think about all the questions that you ask, right? You're doing your stretches, you're taking your medicine, what's going on with PT, how you feel, like you run down the list. But do you ever ask, hey, are you signed up for local emergency alerts? Do you ever ask, hey, do you live in a high fire threat district? Or if you had to evacuate your house, how would you get out? Do you have a go bag or an emergency kit? Right? Probably not. But the fact is that those questions are just as relevant to their health as all the other questions that you go down. And it's a conversation that most people aren't going to want to talk about, right? Especially if you've got a disability, you don't want to talk about it because it's scary. There's a feeling of vulnerability there. What we've seen, though, is as you have those conversations and as people increase their preparedness and resilience, that they move from a place of fear and get to a place of empowerment. And that's important, right? That's essential. It's a huge difference. And so having those conversations with a trusted physician or clinician is a really great setting to be able to start what could be perhaps an uncomfortable but important or even life-saving conversation. And yeah, steer them our way, to give them our website. We've got kits, guides, videos, best document, best practices, all these resources that we can use to empower folks. And they can download all of them for free. But it won't happen unless you ask the question.
And I will just jump in just because DRA has also done a lot of emergency preparedness when it comes to holding cities and counties accountable, in addition to the personal preparedness. There's the piece of, what cities and counties are required to do. And they are required to include people with disabilities in every phase of their emergency preparedness plans, everything from making sure alerts about emergencies that we have notice of are accessible, down, to transportation, to, get out of an area before the hurricane is coming, then looking at shelters and accessibility there. And I think, and then looking at, if you're displaced from your home, where are you going to go? So, while cities and counties do have these responsibilities, that doesn't mean that they've always met them. So I think the personal preparedness, is also important. And it's important to think, for folk, disabled people to think through, places that they go to often, their places of employment, their schools, like what's the emergency evacuation plan for, getting out safely. In our offices, we have emergency evac chairs, so that we know if, the power goes out, can't get down the elevator, I know I can get down the stairs in the emergency evac chair. So just thinking through things like that, I think are really practical and helpful. And honestly, not something that you think about until the emergency happens. And that's what we have found a lot of the time.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've all heard what you've had to say. It's great to increase our sensitivity. It's probably better to plan for than not plan at all, but it's definitely better to plan with and to do these things jointly with the community. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of this has really been prepared by you all, and so it's really great to have this awareness. So really, thank you so much for coming and talking with us today.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.